Welcome to Women History Month. I am Dr. Michelle Chappelle. I'm the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Coordinator here at the Henderson Community College. Today we have Ashley Bernard. She is the proud daughter of public relations education system and a first generation college student. Growing up in a small community shaped her values and influenced her to pursue a career in public service and help others. Ashley is the founder and lead strategist at August Zena Strategy Consulting Group. And she's also assistant coach of the Collegiate School of Medicine and Bioscience Forensic Team in St. Louis, Missouri. Ashley's career includes more than 15 years in nonprofit leadership, management with others, over a decade of experience in sales, organizational funding. Her first year out of college, she focused on grassroots organizations for community groups. In the recent years, she has expanded her list of clients from nonprofit organizations to up and coming politicians, area small business, and local entertainment. Now I turn it over to Ashley.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm glad to be back in Kentucky, even if I'm sitting here in St. Louis. I graduated from Western Kentucky University, so I'm a big fan of the Kentucky area and just really happy to be here. Thank you so much, Dr. Chappelle, for inviting me today, and thank you so much to the administration for having me come to speak to everybody today. I'm going to be talking about women rising against all odds in celebration of Women's History Month. And so I know that the tradition is everybody mutes because we're all online. But if you would like to unmute yourself, I really appreciate hearing verbal feedback. And it's one thing I do miss about having live presentations with real live people. It's getting to hear, what makes sense and what doesn't. There will be time for a question and answer at the end. And so if you do have some questions or something strikes that you would like to add to the conversation at the end, I hope you will please feel free to do so. I really encourage active participation during the meeting. So if you feel like you would like to unmute, just so I can even hear your laughter or hear you groan at my jokes, either one of those is perfectly fine. And I really appreciate being here. So with that said, I will go ahead and get right into it. And I believe everybody can see my screen. Is that correct?
Yes, everybody can see your screen.
All right, great. Part of the conversation about women rising against all odds this year is in part because of how far women have come, and we've been able to see that just by having Vice President Harris become our new vice president. But some of our other standout people in this picture are the leaders of the world and people that we have built upon their shoulders. So I'm going to be taking us back through history first to celebrate women, and then we will move forward through history to talk about how we are building upon the women's movement and women's successes of previous years. So for a little timeline, I won't cover all of these points, but I do want to kind of center us around where we will start our history. So for the United States, women's history didn't start just in 1607 when Jamestown was first opened. The Native Americans here in the United States have a long history of supporting and recognizing women's contributions. So women's history is not new, and it doesn't start with just colonies. But for the purpose of our conversation, we will be starting mostly after the colonies are settled. And so I'm going to take us to the Revolutionary War first. But so that you can kind of see where things fall, I've marked some of the top U.S. wars to show where we are. You'll also see Seneca Falls and the 1920 19th Amendment ratification. And so we are moving forward in history as we go with some of these landmark decisions. And just to kind of ground our conversation today, I'm going to refer us back to the United Nations in their Beijing conference on women's place in the world. This comes from a 1995 report coming out of the United Nations. And it explains throughout women's entire life circle, women's daily existence and their long-term aspirations are restricted by discriminatory attitudes, unjust social and economic structures, and a lack of resources in most of the countries that prevent their full and equal participation. In that article, it explained that this knowledge has been known since 1975. They've started tracking these kinds of outcomes for women. And so when we compare girls to boys and the kinds of preferential treatment that boys are given versus girls worldwide, we still know that there's so much ground to make up for. And then looking historically, I want to shape the lens that we're going to be reviewing everything. And this comes from Dr. Leonard. She's a historian, and she explains that up till now, we've only had a partial analysis. And her explanation is that everything that explains the world has in fact explained a that does not exist. Her explanation is the world in which men are at the center of human enterprise and women origin just simply doesn't exist. Women have been in every single avenue and every single moment of American history. Yet by relegating them to the sidelines or the helping hands means that we are diminishing the actual contributions of women. And so in order for us to actually shape what we know of women and what we have to learn about women from here on out means that we have to rethink about what we know about women. And so if we recenter who is at the center of history, we have to know that men and women equally participated in shaping history. And that's part of why I wanted to use both of these to ground where we are today. And so when we jump all the way back to early America, I'd like to take us back to the Revolutionary War. So the Revolutionary War is typically constrained to a very man-centric story about Revolutionary War heroes like George Washington and the troops that fought against the British. But what is not discussed is women's contribution. Not only did women dress as men and participate in war games, women were the key components to making sure that the troops survived. Miss Reed, or Esther de Reed, she was a British colonialist who came over to the United States when she was married to her husband. And when she came over to the United States, she began to help with the war efforts. And part of her motivation was because she had come from a Protestant family, and her family's life in Britain was disrupted because of conflicts related to the religious conflicts in the area. And so when Miss Reed came to the United States, she was one of the few women that was openly writing about political dissent and about tyranny that she had in the colonies before she moved to the United States. And so in her writing, The Sentiments of an American Woman, this was on the cusp of the beginnings of the American Revolution. She wrote this in order to garner more, in order for women to be able to participate in daily life, which was being significantly disrupted by the Revolutionary War. Part of women's roles changed drastically. So because they had to not only run all the farms, they had to run shops without any of their male partnerships, they also had to supply all of the troops. And through the Sentiments of American Woman and her foundation, the Ladies Association of Philadelphia, Reed earned and raise more than enough money to feed all of the troops, but also clothe. If you'll remember your history, George Washington came very, very close to starving out his own troops. They at one point were boiling shoe leather. Reed had raised enough money to send the troops money, but Washington wrote to her directly, encouraging her not to send the troops money because he feared they would drink, but rather he encouraged her and the other ladies of the Association of Philadelphia, when eventually which expanded all of the colonies for women's groups, encouraged them to raise money, to bring food, and also to tailor and create clothing for all of the troops and send it up. Without their donation of purchased linens and sewing each shirt by hand, the troops would have starved and they would have froze to death in the winter. It's because of her efforts that we even have a revolutionary United States to even begin with. And while we continue to downplay women's understanding of politics, Miss Reed did not. She, in fact, invokes Catherine and Elizabeth's and the other greats of women in history and leadership in her letter to inspire other women. And so because she was so willing to talk about politics and understood the importance of women's role in politics, we can look to Reed as an early example about what it means to be a woman in American history. But not just Reed. This was not an unusual process for women to participate in a vast amount of war and security. Both Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman participated in early rights building for American women as well. Sojourner Truth is well known for her Ain't I a Woman speech at the Akron, Ohio Women's Rights Convention. But before making her famous speech, she became the first African-American woman to sue a white man in court and win. She was able to return her 5-year-old son, Peter, to her because in New York, where she was enslaved, they passed the law that banned slavery. When this happened, the person that enslaved her sold her child to Alabama. But because they did it after the New York law was passed, Sojourner Truth was able to command the courts to reinstate her son to her. And while this is an extremely rare circumstance, not just for African American women winning in court, but for women in general, because if you remember, women had no standing in the courts. And it was only through her ambition and through her willingness to see her child return that she was able to utilize the courts. Harriet Tubman is another wonderful example of someone who does exactly what's needed for women to succeed and to save many, many lives. Of course, we know Harriet Tubman is the most successful Underground Railroad conductor. But the lesser known information is that she's actually was a commander of United States Civil War troops. She led the Union Army in the raid of the Combahee River. And because of her work, she was able to secure the lives of over 750 enslaved people. But that doesn't stop there. The people she freed decided, because of Harriet Tubman, to join up with the Union Army. At this time, the Union Army was rejecting many of the formerly enslaved people's help, men or women. But Harriet Tubman changed the tide, because she asked them to enlist, and because she had already gained the support and the recognition through her wonderful deeds from nursing to supplies to spying, and already learned the trust and respect of Union soldiers. They respected her ambition to be able to lead these troops. She's the first commander to ever be recognized with winning a major battle. This is all history that has kind of been pushed to the wayside. And by kind of, I mean absolutely pushed to the wayside. In order for us to recognize women's history, we have to go back and explore these unseen and untold tales and make sure that they are centered in women's history, but also for all history, because women's history and history in general looks a whole lot different when everyone is included. So now I'm jumping forward quite a bit. So we are moving past the Civil War and into the early attempts at suffrage and obtaining the rights to vote. Part of the problems that we experienced in obtaining the rights was a calculated and unfortunate decision to split power. Susan B. Anthony and Katie Stanton took a stance that they did not want to support African American men having the right to vote before women. And the strategic placement of their obstacle to further suffrage, universal suffrage, makes the split in power that much more problematic. To the understanding, Susan B. Anthony found the term male forced into the Constitution after the 14th Amendment. But because the introduction of the word male into the Constitution for the very first time, Susan B. Anthony read it as a diminishing or a further obstacle for women's suffrage. And so by dividing their power away from African American women who would obviously be supporting African American men to gain the right to vote, Susan B. Anthony and Katie Stanton did us a major disservice. And although they have reunified towards the end, we lost so much more ground because we divided our power. Lucy Stone, on the other hand, co-founded a separate part of the Suffrage Association that did include African American women and continued their support for universal suffrage. When the universal suffrage was sought, they were more successful in gaining larger partnerships with communities. And so Lucy Stone, Susan B. Anthony, and Katie Stanton are all examples about how women tried to utilize their leverage to create partnerships, and also show some of the pitfalls of partnerships. And even though women were eventually able to unify by creating initial division, it's a division that's lasted much, much longer than the early American women's rights to suffrage. We still see them today when we are talking about intersectional feminism. And in order for us to overcome these kinds of obstacles, we must embrace the idea that universal suffrage and human rights are at the core of what it means to be a modern woman and to support modern day feminism. Virginia Louisa, sorry for the error right here. I think the PowerPoint edited my thing. Virginia Minor was a key person in attempting to utilize the courts. And so we talked a little bit about how Sojourner Truth was able to utilize the courts. Virginia Minor attempted to use the courts to justify women's right to vote by the Constitution. So ignoring the introduction of the word male, Virginia Minor in the Minor v. Hapsett court decision from the Supreme Court was dismissed completely, with 100% of the Supreme Court justices finding against Minor that she had no standing in the court in which to be granted the conversation on suffrage and being able to vote. And so, although each had a role in building up towards eventual suffrage, all of these women initially were unable to get the traction that was necessary in order to build the right to vote. And we can learn a lot from them, not just because initially they failed, but because they continued to try. And it was upon their shoulders that we still build upon the conversation for equal rights and human rights in today's world. The fight for fair voting rights has a long stretch as well. It first began making inroads with individual states. Wyoming, of all places, became the very first state to grant women's right to vote. And this was a strategic decision. Wyoming, in hopes to get more people to move to the state, especially women, because at the time, for every one woman, there was 6 men living in Wyoming. In order for the state to grow, they understood the importance of women moving to the state. They figured that if women were allowed the right to vote, they would have a better chance of garnering women's support to move out west. Colorado, Utah, and some of the other western states eventually followed suit, and that's where women began to make their inroads. It was through these individual states that began to buck the system we were able to process towards having the right to vote. Without their efforts, we would not be as far. But secondly, women taking to the streets was another reason that states and eventually the federal government decided that women should have the right to vote. Women began taking the streets very early on with suffrage parades and door-knocking campaigns. But as the time progressed, by 1913, women had stopped being overtly kind about it. And in fact, Alice Paul organized a giant parade to support suffrage to compete directly with President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. This was seen as a really rebellious act, especially from a woman at the time. And in order to compete with his inauguration, her job was to get way more women out than what would be seen or typical for an inauguration. This is the same event that Ida B. Wells had to sneak into the parade because, again, there were still divisions between African American women and white women in trying to form grounds for suffrage. And so in those divisions, there was still a push for women's rights for suffrage. And because of these more extreme and eventually escalating practices, protests were a significant part of why the federal government eventually was willing to sign and support the voting rights for women. And so the winning plan was developed by Carrie Catman Catt, and she began building a mass lobbying effort that went state by state to be able to secure the votes necessary for securing the amendment. And so in order for that amendment to be passed in 1920, it first had to pass the House. It had to be introduced in the House, pass the House, and then through the Senate. It was her work and distancing herself from the protest, allowing the protest to be the bad guy, and allowing her to come and be supposed good guy in introducing legislation that both of those combined convinced legislators of the time to push for women's rights. In 1920, 26 million women became eligible to vote for that during that election. So the amendment was passed in August, and by November, 26 million new people were able to vote. At that same general time, over 500,000 African Americans began leaving the South due to declining conditions and Jim Crow dangers. African Americans quickly moved to the northern states and secured many of the jobs here. And so because of their migration, this shifted voting politics as well. And so by 26 million new voters being added to the rolls, plus the combination of migrating African Americans from the South, there was an entire shift in who was going to be electing the new politicians. And that's how we were able to establish a stronger hold in policy and under the progressive movement. Today, there are 166 million women in the United States, according to the 2018 census. Of them, many of our voter turnouts are increasing over the years. And you can see that on the right for the midterm elections for 2019. Ever so slight the increase, it is still a significant increase. And if you take the number of girls and women that are enrolled in school, you can see that there is a progress and a significant change over time that shows women are wanting to be active in their world and will continue to do so through voting and through policy. Today, women's impact is huge. Experiencing the pandemic through women's eyes is something that is still undertold. The impact on women showed significant problems for women. The census showed Americans missed more work than ever before, in fact, due to childcare problems in 2020. And if you have been teaching, learning, or working during the pandemic and caring for children, then you know exactly why this is the case. According to this particular report, women accounted for 84% of all of the workers who missed in the average month last year for childcare reasons. This means that not only are some of the most significant roles during the pandemic, like nursing and teaching and retail, falling on the shoulders of women, but also childcare as well. And so in order for women to balance these kinds of efforts, there needs to be significant change still. Today, women's work expands some of the most important duties. Again, teachers and nurses. And to that point, if we really say that we do care about women, and we say we care about children, and we say we care about the elderly, then it's most important that we begin to support the very people that take care of the people in need of care. The term she session has become a very popular term to explain the recession that is sitting on the shoulders of women. Say that 3 times fast. The pandemic is being shouldered by women. And because of the pandemic's effect, it is driving women from the workforce in larger numbers. And so all of the vast amount of attempts to overcome both working environments and secure wages, these gains are massively being lost in just 1 year's time. It's expected that over half of the women who were once in the workforce could potentially leave the workforce because of the pandemic's long-term effects. Without significant movement and significant organization of women and partners, we are due to back up many of the gains that women have made. This year, we have seen major gains in the way of representation at a political level. Might I introduce Madam Vice President Kamala Harris? And the significance of having Vice President Harris represent women and African American women as the second highest office is almost unexplainable for someone who's followed politics since she was a little girl. I can't tell you personally how important it is to see a woman on that stage and to finally know that women can do it. Not just because I know women can do it, but because we see the representation right in front of us. But it also means that there's a different kind of advocacy that comes from women in higher up places in politics. We can get the advocacy around childcare, around supporting families and supporting women in the workforce like we have never had before. And I know it's a lot to put on another woman's shoulders that we are counting on her so much. We are counting on her and other women to continue to step up, even during the difficulty of the pandemic. There's still work to do. Equality in employment, Me Too, and women's safety. Women are still facing distinct gender discrimination, whether it's in the workforce, in the house, or out in the community. We still have much work to do to secure equal employment. In fact, just 6% of all CEOs are women. If the goal is to have equal representation to what is in the population, we should expect half of all CEOs to be reflective of the population. Additionally, higher up management levels should also reflect the population. It does not. And so until women can start to obtain and employ their skills in the higher up administration, we still have much work to do. In the past few years, we've heard a lot about Me Too. And Me Too has become its own voice for explaining the kinds of plight women still face today. More than 80% of women have been sexually assaulted or harassed today. I think that is exceptionally unacceptable. And so if we are to make major changes, then we have to start with the kinds of work that Me Too isolates, particularly because it is absolutely within our control. Now, not to say that women are responsible for Me Too, but there are people that are responsible, and their choices have shaped what the experience of women is today. And so it is all of our jobs to make sure men and women are held accountable so that sexual assault and sexual harassment show declines year over year rather than remaining stagnant. Women's safety is still of the utmost importance. Last night, 8 women in Atlanta were killed. The Asian women that were killed from the salons were likely targeted because of not only their race, but because of their status as a woman. Still in today's world, being a woman or a girl puts a target on your back. There is not likely a woman in this room that has not walked at a quicker step speed, not held her keys in her hand, not opted out of escalators or opted out of stairs or going somewhere after dark because of fear for their own safety. At the point that women are constantly in fear for their own safety, or even mildly in fear for their safety, while men operate as if they don't understand or don't have the capacity for comprehending the kinds of danger women face, we still have major work to do. And it's all of our jobs to make sure that that work gets done. According to the World Health Organization, about 1 in 3, or 30%, of the women worldwide have been subjected to physical or sexual intimate partner violence or non-partner sexual violence in their lifetime. It's too much. It's too many women, too many girls that are subjected to this. We still have work to do. And so in celebrating the women and how far we've come, we have to know that we still must do more. We still have to strive to overcome these obstacles so that we can create a safer and better place for women to continue our history. Solutions look a little bit like supporting women. We have to create protection and allow women to access the resources that better their lives. Women have to be given the opportunity to take on jobs outside of the home and outside of women's typical roles. If we continue to lock women into gender-defining workplace roles, then we will only see women's rights continue to slide backwards. And this is how we've ended up in a world where the pandemic is sitting squarely on nurses and teachers and retail operators' shoulders, which typically are women, or more frequently women. We also must allow policy to do work, but we cannot allow policy to be the only work, because policy requires that people vote in these kinds of interests. And what we have seen year after year is that not all policymakers are on board with securing women's rights. So we can't allow policy to be the only dictator of what is fair and what is right in the United States. I like to use the term what's right is right and what's wrong is wrong. We all know treating women fair and equally is right. We know it's wrong when women are abused and when women suffer needlessly. We can make changes in little bits and in large bits at the federal, local, and individual levels. We have to push for those changes to occur. Men have a significant role in this. Being better men and teaching our boys to be better boys is a very important place to start. By teaching these factors about caring for each other and instilling the values of human rights and human dignity at an early age, we have a better shot at overcoming some of the obstacles women have faced historically throughout our history. Some of my references and questions.
Thank you, Ashley, so much.
Thank you
Your
so much for
presentation was very entertaining, and I really appreciate you taking the opportunity today to be here. So I'm going to open up the floor for questions. Please raise your hand. And also, I have put in the chat the link to the survey for today's event, so please fill that out. Anybody have any questions? Edwin, go ahead.
Hi, Ashley. Sorry, I was trying to unlower my hand and unmute myself as well. I really appreciate everything you said. I think you're a very intelligent and insightful woman who has a lot of facts and can also, be ready for anybody to doubt what you are saying. So I really appreciate the resources and the amount of research you've done. I have a question for you. Do you believe, because I think this is a really big topic as well, that the amount of women alone who have influenced our history and have influenced what the society is today is astronomically unforgetting from people in schools? Do you believe there should be a course on women and gender studies? Because I know there is one in college that I took. Do you believe that should be maybe taught at a younger age?
I do. I think women and gender studies is exceptionally important, particularly because we aren't teaching history and we aren't teaching policy. We are still relegating women to the background. We're still relegating women to the helper roles. And when we tell our history without telling the stories of women that actually lived and did, then we are cheating ourselves. And so the only way to overwrite some of the incapabilities of telling history with telling a woman's story is to add additional opportunities for women's stories to be told. And until women can included in the typical history focus, then we absolutely have to do our due diligence to make sure that women's history is set out and explained to the side and how it interacts with the normal history. We've all heard about the Revolutionary War. We can tell you about the battles, but we can't really tell you about the kinds of women that made it all possible. These are key roles, and we should not relegate them to the sidelines. Women's studies is definitely a way to overcome that. I'm a women's studies minor in undergrad, and I'm also in a master's program for women's studies. I'm an absolute proponent of it, and I wish it was more widely accepted in high school. And I think it should also be included at elementary level, because talking about women and girls affects boys also. We have to include these kinds of stories at an early age.
All right. Anybody else have any questions for Ashley? Ashley, I'm looking at the chat, so hold on just a minute. Can Ashley come back for part 2? I would like to attend. So Ashley, would you come back for part 2?
Absolutely.
I really appreciate it. And also we have a very special guest that's just entered into the room. Is Ashley's dad, And today is his birthday.
Happy birthday, Dad.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Gary.
Happy birthday, Gary.
Happy birthday.
All right, Dr. Warren, and I'm assuming that you have your camera on. You would like to say something to Ashley?
I would just like to thank you, Ashley, for presenting today. That was an awesome presentation. And happy birthday, Gary.
Thank you, Dr. Warren. Thank you so much for having me today. I really do appreciate it.
Ashley, I have a question for you. I know with the change in today's society and Madam Vice President Kamala Harris, that's like a mouthful. When she was elected as VP, how did that make, I know you was real excited about it, but how you think society is going to change now we have her in that very high status?
So when I was a little girl, I was always into politics. I always wanted to make a big difference in my community. And so what I knew was that the president could make a really big difference. They had the power to make change, and they would have the power to help lead legislation. And so when I would tell people at a really young age, I mean, like younger than 8 years old, that I wanted to be the president because I could help people, you wouldn't believe the kinds of responses you would get as a little girl. The kinds of responses that came from outside, not my family, but were generally very dismissive. And they also included, no one has ever done that. No women have ever done that before. And while that was very true, it was also really disheartening. That gap of women being in those places existed, made it that much harder to pursue politics. And so I think just being able to see a woman as the Madam Vice President, I think it bridges a gap that we have had for far too long in representation at the highest level of office. We still haven't got to the highest level of office. I'm still waiting for a woman to be president. But I'll take a vice president that can represent 4 women. I'm very hopeful that representation will continue to matter, not because it ends with Vice President Harris, but because it's only the beginning for women to see themselves in those roles.
So Ashley, I see you going for president. I'm gonna vote for you. I'm going to the chat. Minnie Wells said, "Hi Ashley, I was excited to see you presenting today. I remember working with you when you was at Sky Community College." So she said, "Great job." Tracy Story said, "Hi Ashley, great presentation, very engagement. Would love to have you campus for a session." Sarah Crick, who's one of our nursing faculty, she said, "You will have my vote, one for presentation." Amy Zuber said, "Really enjoy your presentation." And I think there is a hand raised. Edwin, go ahead.
Hi, me again, Ashley. I have a question. So I watched a video at a Trump rally when it was Trump and Hillary Clinton running for president. And someone asked why Hillary would not be a good president. And a woman said, "Well, I don't believe a woman should be president because they would be hormonal and too emotional to make decisions as a president should. And they might have a bad day and they might release nuclear weapons." It was a very astronomically shocking response that I saw at this rally. What would you respond to saying that women are hormonal or emotional, or just these kind of preposterous excuses for women being president?
I think women have proven that to not be the case. Some of the best and most developed nations right now are under the leadership of women. In New Zealand right now, COVID-19 has been X'd out multiple times because of the diligent efforts of the New Zealand vice president, or the prime minister rather. Her efforts alone have helped to secure the safety of her island. But you can also look at Angela Merkel out of Germany, which has the strongest economy despite all of the COVID difficulties. And this was before COVID impacted it and still after. Angela Merkel is basically the adult in the room when there were none. And so when we say that women are especially emotional or especially prone to having a bad day, I push back that we all have bad days and then we can all have emotional responses, but we all have to have emotional intelligence to be able to respond accordingly. And I think the right woman will have those kinds of capabilities, just like we would expect a man to have all of those capabilities too. Women have every right to be everywhere women want to be. And so I think whether it's the White House or whether it's their home, they have every right to command the respect and the dignity that they need to be able to push for change and push for reform despite naysayers.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you, Evelyn.
All right, anybody else have any questions for Ashley? Your dad keeps coming back and forth, so I don't know, it's something wrong. And I apologize, Ashley's internet connection. I know there was a little lag on her end. It's probably because of the weather, because we talked about that early before the presentation. So I'm hoping that you could still hear mostly of her presentation minus the lag. So anybody else has any questions for Gary? Are you in here? Are you here now? This is her dad I'm talking to. Actually, it looks like your dad is having problems, so you might want to call him when you get done. So I'll apologize. Well, if anybody doesn't have any more questions for Ashley, I will end the presentation. Thank you again for attending the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Women History Month. I've also put the survey out in the chat, and also will send the survey out to you via email. So have a good day.
Thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time to come in and do this presentation.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you, Ashley. Ashley, we can stay on afterwards.
Okay. Have a good day.